Good morning, everyone. My name is Avi. For those of you who don't know me, my full name is Avishek Pandari. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Accounting at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I'm chairing Emily's dissertation, and it has been a great honor to work with Emily in her dissertation. She has huge deal of accounting industry experience. She has taught wide variety of accounting classes, and she has done bunch of accounting community services as well, including volunteering, income tax assistant VITA. She's involved with AICPA. She's involved with American Accounting Association. And more importantly to me, she has pretty impressive research skills, and I'm so proud of her. And it has been great privilege to work with Hamid and Babak in this dissertation as well. And thank you, Praveen, for your support and guidance so far. So in this dissertation, Emily, she investigates the impact of city-level climate risk disclosure on city-level bond ratings. Just looking at the title of this topic, climate risk disclosures, you could think that this is a very timely dissertation topic, which has a pretty good potential for publication in a top-tier accounting journal. So yeah, without any further ado, I will let Emily to defend her dissertation. My best wishes.
Thank you, Avi. And thank you, everybody, for being here today in the room, as well as all of the people that I know are watching online and cheering me on today. I appreciate all of you. Thank you for being here for my defense of my dissertation titled City Climate Disclosures and Municipal Bond Ratings. So before I get started to talk about my study, I first want to dedicate my dissertation as well as just acknowledge the many people who have supported me on this journey. I would like to dedicate first my dissertation to my husband, who's here today, Drew, and our two sons. So all of them have made many, many sacrifices in order to let me pursue this dream, and I just can't even express my gratitude enough to all three of them. So Drew, Will, and Charlie, who are back in Michigan in school today, this is for you. I also want to acknowledge the wide network of family and friends that I have that have really just put up with me over these last 3 years and just reminded me that I can do this even when it was really hard. And so I thank all of you, and I know many of you are watching today. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank my committee. I truly believe I had the best dissertation committee ever. Avi, Hamid, and Babak, thank you so much for your patience with me, your thorough and insightful feedback. You are just a group of just incredible researchers, and I was truly honored to have you as my committee, and I just appreciate all the work that you put into this with me. I have to give a special thanks to my dissertation chair, Avi. Thank you for all the time that you spent with me, all the encouragement that you gave me. You told me from the very beginning, over 2 years ago, that this was going to be a difficult study, but you also understood my passion for this topic, and you helped me to see it through. And I could not have done it without you. So thank you, Avi, for everything. Quickly, I'd also like to thank Dr. Praveen and the entire UW Whitewater DBA program, all of my professors in the program. It was such a wonderful, albeit challenging experience. It was truly great, though, and I appreciate all of you so much. And last but not least, and then we'll move on, I promise, a thank you to my fellow members of Cohort 7. We like to say we were the best cohort ever. And I couldn't agree more, and it was just truly an honor to be part of this group of just exceptionally talented and intelligent people. So thank you, Cohort 7. I know you're out there today. I appreciate you. Okay, so let's move on to the topic of today. You can see the agenda listed here. First, I'll talk about my overall research question, as well as kind of my motivation for asking that question. I'll talk about what I consider to be the many contributions of this study. Quickly, we'll go through the literature review that I conducted before moving on to talking about the theories that I used to really develop my hypotheses. We'll talk about my research design and my empirical models that I used to test my hypotheses. We'll talk then, hopefully spend most of our time talking about my sample description and my empirical results, as well as the many robustness tests that we conducted. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the limitations of my study, some of the potential future studies that I can conduct using this data, and then we'll conclude with any questions that you have. Okay, so my overall motivation for my research question. So as Avi mentioned, climate change is certainly a current important issue in the world today. And there has been a lot of research and a lot of research in the accounting streams that have really looked at the effect of climate change on companies. That academic research, however, has really largely focused on for-profit corporations. However, cities account for approximately 80% of global GDP and at least 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And just like corporations, they're under pressure to disclose their climate information as well. So, and they may be more inclined to do so because we're seeing some streamlining in the climate change reporting standards. For instance, with the recently established International Sustainability Standards Board. So potentially we're going to see more and more of these cities disclosing their climate change information. In addition, I think about the fact that, the municipal bond market is significant in the United States, worth about $3.8 trillion. And we know that cities rely on municipal bonds to finance some of their major projects. And we also know that their cost of issuance of those bonds is at least partially determined by their bond ratings. And so this kind of brings me to my overall research question of, do voluntary climate disclosures affect municipal bond ratings? So I've decided to kind of take this research stream and apply it to what is really a new context, one that little has been done in this city context so far, even though cities really play an important role in the climate change conversation. So I think that my contribution has many contributions, or my study has many contributions, excuse me. And so first, I think that I certainly contribute to two very important streams of literature. First, the voluntary disclosure literature. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first study that investigates the effects of voluntary climate disclosures in that city context. Also contributing to the municipal bond literature by really establishing another factor that might affect bond ratings. I also believe that I am extending two specific studies, Rashidi et al. From 2019, as well as a study by Painter in 2020. So the Rashidi et al. Study was really a qualitative study where they interviewed investment firms, city officials, as well as rating agencies. And what they found is that really there was a positive response from those investment firms and from those bond raters when a city had climate policies or were engaged in climate action. And so I believe I'm extending this study by really taking a quantitative approach to look at how that climate action or those disclosed climate actions might affect bond ratings. The Painter study from 2020, this was a study that looked at whether the municipal bond market accounts for climate risk. And what they found is that bond issuance costs were in fact higher for cities that had higher climate risk. And so I'm extending this by saying, okay, instead of looking at investors, let's look at bond raters. And let's see how the effect of climate change disclosures, which includes their risk, but also includes the things that they're doing to mitigate that risk, that climate risk, and how that might affect their bond ratings. There are many stakeholders, I believe, that will be interested in the results of this study, including city officials. So I mentioned that cities rely on bond financing. And so they're going to be interested in understanding how their climate action and their climate disclosure is affecting their bond ratings, which we know is one of the drivers of their cost of bond issuance From prior studies, we know that. So potentially, the results of this study is going to drive the level of disclosure, the types of disclosures that a city might present, and really maybe even influence the climate action that they engage in. I also think that this study will be interesting to investors. I mentioned that the municipal bond market is significant at $3.8 trillion in the US. And so I think that, that investors are going to be interested to understand how climate information is incorporated into those bond ratings as they make their investment decisions. And lastly, I think that this study also potentially has public policy implications. We're seeing more and more that regulators and policymakers are making decisions on what the disclosure requirements need to be when it comes to climate change. And so potentially they're going to be interested to understand the results of this study as well. So I believe many contributions and many stakeholders will be interested in this study. So I want to quickly go through the literature review just to kind of talk about the different studies that I found as I conducted this review. First, I did conduct a review in both the municipal bond rating literature as well as the voluntary disclosure literature. We're going to start with the municipal bond ratings. And really, I focused my research or my study on really looking at the determinants of those bond ratings. So what was determining what those bond ratings were going to be? And you can see in the table, I have this kind of organized by the different categories of the explanatory variables that are used in those prior studies. So you can see demographic variables have been established to affect bond ratings, such as population and unemployment rate. Also, many studies looking at different types of accounting information or financial information that might affect bond ratings. You can see a number of studies there. Continuing on to the next slide, other accounting factors have been found to affect bond ratings, such as large firm audits, financial reporting quality, and timeliness. And then still even other factors like management performance, forms of government, and even local religious beliefs having been found to affect bond ratings. So I also conducted a search in the voluntary disclosure literature stream. Now this is if you're not familiar with this stream of literature, it's a very rich and robust and very, there's a lot going on there with voluntary disclosure literature. So I had to kind of narrow down my literature review a little bit by focusing on, first, I focused on voluntary environmental disclosures, which are in line with climate change disclosures. And then I really was looking at what are the effects, what are the studies that investigated the effects of those voluntary disclosures, which was what I'm doing in my study as well. So you can see how this is organized. I have this organized by the context in which the study was conducted, and then the various dependent variables that were used in those studies. So notice that much of the research in this area is done at the firm level. We have several studies here that look at the effect of voluntary environmental disclosures on things like firm performance, firm valuation, credit ratings, and environmental performance. And very little has been done at the city level. So I did find one study that looked at kind of the trade-off between voluntary environmental disclosures and the cost of capital, the potential to reduce cost of capital. But that's really it. And so when I say that I really feel like I'm one of the first studies that is really looking at this, this kind of illustrates that. Even a couple of studies at the macroeconomic level as well, looking at the effect on economic growth. You'll see when I get into my research design that I also use disclosure quality as one of my variables. So I also took a look at the literature that investigates the effect of disclosure quality. And you can see a couple of several firm level studies here that look at the effect of that disclosure quality on things like firm performance and firm valuation. Okay, so moving right on to the theories that I used and my hypothesis development. So you can see here that I'm proposing a framework where voluntary climate disclosures and disclosure quality have a positive or are positively associated with the municipal bond ratings. Furthermore, I'm also positing that the level of disclosure enhances that relationship between the disclosure quality and the bond rating, such that the quality will have a greater impact on the bond rating for cities that have higher levels of disclosure. So let's kind of break that down a bit more, and I'll further describe how I develop those hypotheses, really using a very solid foundation in theory. So for hypothesis 1, voluntary climate disclosures are positively associated with a city's municipal bond rating. I use 4 theories here. First, information theory. Information theory suggests that the disclosure will result in reduced information asymmetry and thus an improved financial outcome for the provider of the information. I also use voluntary disclosure theory. This really is suggesting that the choice to voluntarily disclose above and beyond stakeholder expectations is going to improve financial outcomes for the information provider. And I'm suggesting that improved financial outcome includes an improved or higher bond rating. I also rely on 2 other theories, legitimacy theory and signaling theory. Legitimacy theory suggests that the presence of the climate disclosures may legitimize the city's climate information, leading to that positive response from the bond raters. And then signaling theory suggests that when cities voluntarily disclose, they're really signaling to those rating agencies that they have the ability to absorb the cost of that transparency. And so all 4 of these theories are really suggesting or supporting the hypothesis that there will be a positive association between voluntary disclosures and bond ratings. So for hypothesis number 2, I'm looking at the direct effect or the association between the quality of the voluntary climate disclosures and the city's bond rating. And for this, I'm using the same 4 theories. And really just suggesting that higher quality is going to further reduce the information asymmetry, it's going to better legitimize the information, and it's going to send a stronger signal to those stakeholders or those bond raters. So again, suggesting a positive association between quality and the bond rating. And lastly, my hypothesis number 3 is looking at the moderating effect of disclosure level. It states that disclosure level will moderate the relationship between disclosure quality and the bond rating, such that there is a significant positive relationship between quality and bond ratings when the disclosure level is high, but not when it is low. And so for this, I'm really focusing on 2 theories here, legitimacy and signaling theory. Legitimacy theory stating that higher levels of disclosure will better legitimize the information compared to those low-level disclosures, so lower-level disclosures. And signaling theory suggesting that at higher levels of disclosure, the firm's ability to absorb, to really signal their ability to absorb those, the cost of that transparency is going to be stronger for those high-level disclosures versus low-level. So really, kind of in summary, saying that the value relevance of that disclosure quality to the rating agency is going to be stronger for cities with high levels of disclosure than compared to cities with low-level disclosures. And to say that just one more way, in other words, we're saying that the quality of city climate disclosures is not really relevant to bond raters until certain levels of disclosure are reached. Okay, so now moving into my research design and empirical models. So first I'll talk about how I measured and the data that I used for all of my variables of interest, starting first with the level of voluntary climate disclosure. So this information was pulled from what's called the CDP database. So the CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, this is a global nonprofit organization that collects climate information from companies and cities every year. And there are many prior studies that use CDP disclosures as a proxy for climate disclosures. Mostly this has been done in the corporate context, however. Very few studies have actually been able to use the city CDP data. So this was something I was really excited to do, to be able to use the city climate disclosures in a study as a proxy for climate disclosures. So I measured this by constructing an index based on the number of equally weighted items disclosed by cities to the CDP compared to the total number of items in the CDP questionnaire. So similar to prior studies, you can see how I calculate that index at the bottom of the slide. And I had to be sure that I really clearly distinguished quantity from quality, because I also have a quality variable in my study. So because of that, I'm just really constructing this based on the number of items disclosed as compared to the total number of items in the questionnaire. Next is my disclosure quality construct. I also relied on the CDP database for this as well. And actually, the CDP issues scores to cities based on quality, and how they measure quality is really looking at the disclosed mitigation and adaptation activities of the city. So first, let me talk to you about what adaptation and mitigation mean. So a mitigation activity from a climate change perspective is where a city is doing something to either stop or slow the progression of climate change. So they're doing things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, using green energy, things like that. That is a mitigation activity. An adaptation activity, on the other hand, are activities that a city is going to do to kind of prepare for the inevitable effects of climate change. So things like, strong storms or wildfires, things like that. So what are they doing to kind of prepare and adapt to the effects of climate change? And so the way that the CDP looks at this says, okay, if a city is engaging in climate action, either mitigation or adaptation, they're going to receive a higher score from us, because it's showing that they're not just accepting climate change, they're acting and reacting to climate change and being proactive. And if you think about this kind of from the perspective of the bond raters, bond raters are going to prefer cities that not just tell us what their climate risk is, but also what are they doing to kind of mitigate that climate risk? What are their climate actions? And so I was able to rely on these CDP scores that are based on mitigation and adaptation activities, but not entirely, because the CDP only started scoring cities in 2018. And you'll see later that my sample time period goes back to 2011. So from 2018 to 2021, I'm able to measure quality using those CDP scores. But for the prior years, 2011 to 2017, thankfully, the CDP also publishes and discloses their methodology for their scores. So I was able to kind of apply that methodology to the prior years in order to identify those mitigation and adaptation disclosures. And so I was able to kind of score those cities using the CDP methodology in those prior years. And so what I ended up having here is this is measured as an indicator variable, where a 1 indicates at least one climate action is disclosed, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and a 0 otherwise. Lastly, my dependent variable, the municipal bond rating. This I pulled from the Bloomberg database, and I pulled both the S&P and Moody ratings for all cities in the US. And this is in line with prior studies. You can see the conversion table on the slide. These bond ratings are actually in alpha form, so I needed to convert those to numeric form. And I did this following prior studies where higher values are associated or indicate a higher bond rating. And so you can see my conversion table on the slide. I also used an average bond rating, and what I mean by this is that it's possible that a a bond, a single bond, can be rated by both agencies, and potentially the corresponding number is different for each rating or for each agency. And so where that happens, I would use an average bond rating for that particular year. In addition to that, it's also possible that cities have multiple bond issues in a year and therefore possibly multiple bond ratings in a year. And so for those cases, I also used an average bond rating for the year for that city. So based on prior municipal bond rating studies, my model also needed to include various demographic and financial variables to be used as control variables. These are variables that are known to affect bond ratings, and so I needed to include those in my empirical models. So you can see my city level control variables are listed here. The demographic variables like population and unemployment rate, I'm able to pull that information from the census information. However, all of those financial variables were pulled from the individual financial reports of every city in my sample. So this ended up being quite a time-consuming process. But in the end, I was able to construct a novel data set of city-level information that includes their climate disclosure information from the CDP. It includes their bond ratings, as well as all of these key city-level control variables. Okay, so let's look at my empirical models. So I did use what's called ordered logic regression, and this is given the ordinal nature of my dependent variable, the bond rating. So I used ordered logic regression to test my hypotheses. And you can see my empirical model here for the test of H1, looking at the effect of climate disclosure level on bond ratings. Notice that my model includes all of those city level control variables, as well as year and state fixed effects. So the purpose of the year and state fixed effects is to really make sure that I'm controlling for any year-specific or state-specific events or factors that might affect the bond rating. So what I'm expecting here is a positive coefficient on the disclosure level construct when I test H1. For H2, again, I use ordered logic regression, and this is the model that I have estimated for H2 to really look at the effect of disclosure quality on the bond rating. So notice this is the same model, only now I'm testing disclosure quality, and again, expecting a positive coefficient on that construct. To test H3, remember this was the moderating effect of disclosure level. And so for this, I used a split sample analysis based on disclosure level. And so the high and low disclosure level subsamples are partitioned using the median value of disclosure level. And what I expect is I expect to see a positive coefficient on that disclosure quality construct for cities that have high levels of disclosure, which would suggest that that value relevance of disclosure quality is really stronger for cities in that high disclosing subsample. Okay, so now let's get into my sample description, and then we'll talk about my empirical results. So my test sample included US cities who disclosed to the CDP from 2011 to 2021. So 2011 is really the first year that the CDP administered their city survey. And 2021 was the last full year of data that I could collect at the time of collection. You can see in the table here that the number of cities disclosing to the CDP has increased quite significantly over time. And in total, there were 221 US cities, unique cities that disclosed to the CDP in this timeline. However, I did have to exclude any cities that did not have a bond rating in my time period, as well as a few cities due to the fact that I wasn't able to collect some of their key city level variables. So I ended up with 156 cities in my final sample. Keep in mind that cities may have disclosed just 1 year of this 11-year period, or maybe up to 11 years, all 11 years of this period, and anywhere in between. So what that turned out to be is it resulted in 633 city year observations. So first, let's talk about my descriptive statistics. So you can see my descriptive statistics results for all of my variables. You may notice in the second line that I have an additional measure of rating, of the bond rating, rate SP. That was an additional measure that I used in robustness tests that I'll talk about later. But you can see highlighted the mean values of both measures of bond ratings, as well as my two independent variables, disclosure level and disclosure quality. This table presents the correlation matrix for my main model variables, as well as that alternative measure of bond rating, which again was used in my robustness tests. In yellow, you'll see that the correlation between disclosure level and both measures of bond rating is significant at the 5% level, whereas disclosure quality is positively associated with the bond rating measures at a 1% level. So going forward, the asterisks mean 3 stars is a 1% significance, 2 stars is 5%, 1 star is a 10% significance. So what this shows here is it's really indicating univariate support for both H1 and H2, the association between disclosure level and bond ratings and disclosure quality and bond ratings. So now I'll describe my multivariate analysis of my hypotheses. And so this table represents the ordered logic regression results for my hypothesis or my test of H1, the effective city-level disclosures on bond ratings. So these are my results. Highlighted in yellow are the results for disclosure level. And in each of these columns, my model is really kind of progressing and evolving. So in the first column of results, I'm just including my variable of interest, the disclosure level. And then as I move to the right, I'm adding other elements to my model. So I first add control variables, then I add state fixed effects, then year fixed effects. And it's really the last column that represents my full model, including control variables in both state and year fixed effects. So if we look at disclosure level in that last column, you can see that the coefficient is positive and it's significant at the 5% level. Thus, results are supporting H1, indicating a positive association between disclosure level and bond ratings. So before I move on to H2, I want to talk about the robustness test that we also conducted for H1. So the first robustness test we did was we used what's called an entropy balancing approach. And we did this using the mean and median levels of disclosure level. And so what this table represents are the ordered logic regression results after the entropy balancing, so conducted on that entropy balance sample. So I've kind of omitted the controls here, but you can see that in the first column, I did not include controls or fixed effects, but in the last column I did. And so that's really representative of my full model. And using that entropy balance sample, my disclosure level is positive and significant at the 10% level in this case. So this provides additional support for my H1. In addition to the entropy balance sample, we also conducted the ordered logic regression using that alternative measure of bond rating. So this was rate SP. So prior studies have found that the Moody rating has been likely to have somewhat of a downward bias. And so therefore I include this additional measure of bond rating using the S&P rating whenever a rating exists for both agencies. So remember before I would use that average. Now I'm choosing the S&P over the Moody rating when a rating exists from both. So that's my additional measure of bond rating here. And again, you can see we ran this analysis using both the original sample as well as the entropy balance sample. And in both cases, the disclosure level construct is positive again, significant at the 5% level using the original sample, and at the 10% level for the entropy balance sample. Next, I mentioned that I used ordered logic regression for my analysis, which is the appropriate technique given that ordinal non-continuous nature of my dependent variable. However, compared to ordered logic regression, OLS, or ordinary least squares regression, may be more robust to certain model specification issues, such as when the error term is not normally distributed. So I also tested my hypothesis using OLS regression. And so here you can see the results of OLS regression on H1. And the last column shows, again, my entire model using controls and fixed effects. And you can see disclosure level is, again, positive at the 10% level, further supporting my H1. Last robustness test for H1 is I also ran the OLS regression using the entropy balance sample. And so you can see if you focus on the last column that includes my full model, disclosure level is positive and significant here at the 5% level. Again, further support for H1. So moving on to H2, these are the full results for the ordered logic regression of my test of H2, the effect of disclosure quality on bond ratings. And again, you can see that my model evolves as you move to the right, and it's really the last column that represents my full model with control variables and fixed effects. And you can see that disclosure quality in this case is positive and significant at the 10% level when using the ordered logic regression. So these results also support H2, indicating that higher disclosure quality is associated with higher bond ratings. So now let's talk about the robustness test for H2. So this table represents the test of H2, again using ordered logic regression, but after entropy balancing, so using the entropy balance sample. And you can see in the last column that disclosure quality is again positive at the 10% level using the entropy balance sample. So this is further support for H2. Next, I used my alternative measure of rating, rate SP. And you can see in the last column again for disclosure quality, positive coefficient at the 10% level using that alternative measure of bond rating. Further support for H2. And lastly, for H2, I ran OLS regression for this model as well. And again, you can see that the results are consistent with my main analysis. Disclosure quality is positive and significant at the 10% level. Okay, so now the results from my main analysis of H3. So again, using ordered logic regression analysis and really showing using that split level or split sample analysis where I partitioned that sample between high and low level disclosures based on the median value of disclosure level. And so you can see that the disclosure quality is positive and significant at the 10% level for those high level disclosures, but positive and not significant for low levels of disclosure. So this does support my H3, indicating that the value relevance of disclosure quality to rating agencies is going to be stronger at those higher levels of disclosure. So the robustness test for H3, first, I did run the analysis using the entropy balance sample, and results are consistent. You can see again that disclosure quality is positive and significant at the 10% level for the high level subsample, and positive and not significant for the low level sample. Ran the analysis with the alternative measure of rating as well, using both the original sample and the entropy balance sample. And you can see again that results are consistent for H3, so further support for H3 in that those results for disclosure quality are positive and significant for the high-level disclosures and not the low-level subsample. And lastly, for H3, I ran the analysis using OLS regression. And I did this using both measures of bond rating, my main measure, as well as my additional measure, rate SP. And again, further support for H3. You can see in both cases that the high-level subsample is positive and significant, whereas the low-level sample is positive but not significant. Okay, so those were the results of my study. No study is perfect, and mine certainly is not, so my study does have some limitations. First, omitted variable bias, really just the potential that there's something that I'm missing in my models. I feel like I addressed this well by including those key level city control variables as well as state and year fixed effects. But of course, it's possible and that there's something missing from my models that is also affecting bond ratings. But I do think I addressed that with both the control variables and year and state fixed effects in my main models. There's also a potential for self-selection bias in that the cities that do provide those disclosures are going to be large and rich compared to cities that don't provide the disclosures, and so really kind of a bias to my sample and the potential that may be what's driving my results. And so for this, we addressed that by using the entropy balancing approach, which we conducted using both the mean and median levels of disclosure level. And lastly, there's the potential for measurement bias. I addressed this by using that additional measure for the dependent variable that you saw me use in all of my robustness tests. So there are many opportunities for future studies. The data I mentioned for this study was difficult, challenging, and very time-consuming to retrieve. But one of the ways that I sort of rationalized that was, kind of the time and effort that I put into that was to really consider all of the ways that I can use this novel data set for future studies. And so you can see some of these listed here. I'm interested in looking at the effects of those city climate disclosures on other outcomes other than bond ratings. I think we can also look at the contagious effects of those city climate disclosures on firms that are headquartered in that city. I think there are many other moderating effects that we could look at, like management characteristics. It'd be interesting to look at the antecedents to voluntary disclosures at the city level, so what's really driving them to actually disclose the information. And I'd like to look at the potential for those climate disclosures to really mitigate or maybe enhance the effects of climate risks. So how does that play or moderate that relationship? And then I'm also looking, and I'd like to look at different ways that I can measure that quality and maybe look at how mitigation versus adaptation activities may affect the bond ratings or other outcomes differently. And I'm sure there are many more. So in conclusion, this study provides evidence that cities' climate disclosures and disclosure quality are positively associated with bond ratings, and that disclosure level really enhances that positive effect of disclosure quality. So I think the empirical results are not only contributing to existing literature, but they're also providing information for key stakeholders. And I'm really kind of moving this research into the city context, which I think is a very important perspective in the climate change conversation. And while many cities do disclose climate information in the annual CDP questionnaire and other places, prior to this study, really the relevant effects of those disclosures were not fully understood. So I'm very proud to be able to present some results today and provide some contributions to the climate change conversation. So with that, are there any questions?
Great presentation, Emily.
Thank you.
It could not have been better. Like amazing, amazing.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
proud of you. I have always been proud of you. So while during your presentation, I noted down a couple of questions. Okay. So my first question is, I know in your literature review and in your hypothesis development, you pointed out 4 different theories: information theory, voluntary disclosure theory, legitimacy theory, and signaling theory, right? And I think Babak also mentioned during the proposal defense that it's good for dissertation, but when you want to later send to some journal, they don't like a lot of theories, okay? So if you have to pick 2 theories out of these 4 theories, let's say you are sending this paper to a journal and you have to pick 2 best theories. So which of those would be?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about because you're right, Babak had mentioned this in the proposal, that I do have a lot of theories. And I wanted to keep those theories for the dissertation just to show the strong theoretical foundation for my hypotheses. But I do think that if and when I submit this to a journal, I can focus on the voluntary disclosure theory, which is really similar to information theory, and I think is really the best fit for a voluntary disclosure study. And then between the other 2, I think I would focus on signaling theory. Signaling theory and legitimacy theory, again, are similar. And I think that signaling theory really is the best representation of really the voluntary disclosure is signaling their confidence in the information, their ability to absorb that cost of transparency. So if I had to pick the 2, I think the first 2 are very similar, so I would go with voluntary disclosure theory. And the second 2 theories I think are similar, but I would go with signaling theory for that.
Okay, good job. And I know, like you mentioned, you have control for state fixed effects and year fixed effects in your model, right? And we know that you have control for those. And I'm really glad you mentioned during your presentation why you control for them. Okay, that was very important part. But could you please explain what stopped you from using city fixed effects, because that looks like more robust?
Yeah, definitely. So what we found with city fixed effects is that we really didn't have enough within city variation for both the disclosures and the bond ratings. And so if we add city fixed effects, we kind of lose results because there's not enough variation within cities in that time period. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. Good,
Okay.
good. And one of your limitations that you pointed out was, I believe, omitted variable bias. And you pointed that out as a limitation. And you also said you control for so many other factors, right?
Yep.
Like other control variables, including population and all tax revenue and other control variables. And you also control for definitely state fixed effects and year fixed effects, right?
Yeah.
But you can't control everything in your model. Have you thought about any, or for your future plan, when you plan to send it to journal, have you thought about any endogeneity test that you want to use to address omitted variable bias problem? Because it's not been addressed, right? Yeah.
Any additional tests?
Yeah. As an additional, have you thought about any endogeneity test, like you want to like instrumental variable test or something like that?
Oh, sure. So yes, actually, this is something that I tried to do. I tried to include a robustness test called a 2-stage least squares using an instrumental variable test. And I wasn't able to ultimately do that. I did identify an instrumental variable, and I did actually even collect the data for this instrumental variable. But what happened is that instrumental variable ended up being positively correlated with my dependent variable. And therefore I couldn't use it. I needed something that could be associated and positively associated with my independent variables, but not my dependent variable. And that didn't work out for me. It was correlated, it was highly correlated with my dependent variable, so I wasn't able to use that instrumental variable. But I would like to continue down that road in the future because I think it's something that I should address. But it's a matter of identifying the right instrumental variable and then collecting the data that I think will take some time. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that
Okay.
answers my question. And you could collect next time probably bunch of different potential instrumental variables.
Yeah.
Hopefully one of them won't be so strongly correlated with the dependent variable, right? So that's the best route.
I think that would also address any reverse causality concerns.
Yeah. IV regression.
I anticipate that I may have to address at some point in a journal, so that's my plan.
And so your main regression results have R squared around at like the main model has around 9% for ordered logic regression. Sometimes it is 11, 8, 9, on average 9 or 10%. So is it common, like why such a low R square?
Yeah, this was a concern I had as well. I at first kind of thought my R squareds were low, but really when you look at city level bond rating studies, my R squareds are pretty typical.
Okay.
And I think the reason for this is if you think about research that's done at the firm level, where you can just collect so many different variables from these databases that are available to you, and really include so many different things in your model. We don't have things like that for a city level study. For a city level study, we have to collect that information from various sources, and it's a time-consuming process. So we're kind of limited on the variables that we can include as in our model to really kind of increase those R squared numbers. So it's typical, and I think I don't know if you noticed, but even though I know ordered logic regression is appropriate given my dependent variable, you may have noticed that my R squareds actually increased quite a bit in my OLS regression results.
In OLS regression, how much is your R square?
Let's go back. I think it's around 30 or 40%. So here, this is OLS. This is at 35.
Yeah.
I think it gets as high as, here's 446.
Okay, 45. Okay, got it.
So OLS increases my R squared quite a bit. Do you want me to linger here?
No, that's fine. That's fine. I think you answered the question. Thank you. And your quality variable is dummy variable 1 versus 0, right? And I can't help myself thinking, okay, it would have been so great if it was continuous variable.
Yeah.
Like it's quality. So can you talk about it? Like, is it limitation of your study or what it is?
Yes, this is something that I hope to improve as this study kind of progresses. The limitation here is that really the city questionnaires from the CDP didn't start until 2011, and the questionnaire itself has really evolved since then, and it's not entirely consistent from year to year. So I didn't feel comfortable going beyond the indicator variable given the inconsistencies in the questionnaires over time. But I do want to explore that and try to figure out a way to create more variation in that disclosure quality. I had hoped to use the CDP scores, which is more than just a 1-0. It's at least goes up to 4. It's 1 through 4. But they didn't start doing that until 2018, and that I couldn't afford to lose that many observations to start in 2018. And applying that methodology to the prior years, I just didn't feel comfortable going beyond the indicator variable. But I do want to explore that. I do want to figure out a way that, a different way to maybe measure disclosure quality. And that's something I'll look into.
Well, great job. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I have a few questions. The first one is about the data. Are there any observations that didn't that stopped or reduced the number of climate related disclosure.
Any observations where
So that you would,
they
yeah.
disclosed and then they didn't?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have any ideas what you could do with them?
That's interesting. I'll have to think about that, but I think so. So what it's kind of all over the place, but I've seen, where you have maybe a city that disclosed 9 out of the 11 years, but for 2 of those years they didn't. For example, and this might be interesting actually, the COVID years, 2020 and 2021, we actually had some cities that had been disclosing all along and didn't.
Okay.
In 2020 or 2021. And I assume in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, they were, maxed out with their resources because of COVID issues or something like that. And they didn't have the capacity to respond to the survey. But that would be interesting to look at.
How would that? Yes. So I don't know if that would actually impact the bond rating, because bond ratings are so sticky.
Yes.
But then, is there a way to actually look at the like if those differences or if those changes are priced in the market?
Yeah.
Think about how would that impact the market perception of the quality too?
Yeah, looking at like bond prices and interest
Bond
rates
yields
or
and
bond yields.
yeah. Yeah, so I thought maybe you could actually add another test that you would, or at least consider if that's even possible, to see if this quality that you find, this impact on the rating, is actually priced in also.
Yeah. So I was hoping to never have to go into the Bloomberg lab again, but you're going to make me, aren't you? So I don't. You may not know, but retrieving data from the Bloomberg database is limited.
Yeah.
And I could only pull so much at one time, and so this ended up being a months-long process just to get bond ratings.
Yeah.
But
Well, just something to consider.
yeah, no, I definitely like the idea. I definitely like
the rest of my comments aren't this isn't about the content, it's how you present it. For example, some of the tables in the version that I have don't have the expected sign. I would also recommend that you add the information about fixed effect, whether they are included or not, at the bottom of all the tables.
Yep.
And then there was, this came up with Avi's discussion as well. The rate SP and rate average, both, they have a very high correlation. They're like 97. They're literally the same thing.
Yeah.
So you might actually have to find something else for
different way to measure that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Baba, can you hear us? Oh, we can. Do you need to turn on your mic or something?
Nick will tell us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Should I go ahead?
Yep. You're good.
Okay. So I don't have questions. I just have a couple of suggestions based on what Avi and Hamid told. So I suggest including why you don't control for city effects in the manuscript, because you don't want the reviewer to come back and ask you to include it. Because the problem is that if the reviewer asks us to include it, and if you don't get the result, then it would seem bad. But if you be upfront about it earlier on, I think that would be a better approach. That's it. And obviously, you would need to discuss it with the.
Okay.
Baba, can you hear me?
Babak, were you?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Hear.
Okay. So I just want to brought this up because since Hamid also asked this question, so the dissertation guideline here last time I received was that not add, like we could do that for when she sends her paper to a journal, not add like state and year fixed effects at the bottom. Because it's repetitive something, so rather include that as a note. So that's just a dissertation guideline here. But you are totally right. That is what we do, and she should do that definitely to send it to some journal. But that's just a dissertation guideline. It is the most recent one. I received last time. So in the table, don't include state and fix effects, yes, 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 or something like that. Rather include those as notes. Okay, yeah.
One more comment that I have is about indigeneity. So I received the revision from from a journal, and in that journal, the editor actually suggested a paper that discusses indigeneity tests without using instrumental verbs. The title, I'm going to send you the paper. There are two tests, Gaussian-Coppola test and higher moment test. And this paper is published in Top Management Journal.
Oh.
So I can send you, or Avi, the codes, the data codes, and the citation. And if you hopefully, when you run the analysis, if your results hold, then you wouldn't need for instrumental verbal.
That would be great. Yes, if you could send that to me, that would be wonderful. If I didn't have to identify and collect data for an instrumental variable.
Yes. Yeah. One final comment. You mentioned something about the change in methodology after 2018. I know it's a long shot, but what you can do, conduct subsample analysis in post-2018 period only. If your results hold, you can mention that our results are consistent, even if we change methodology. But if the results don't hold, there's nothing we can do about that, and you wouldn't mention.
Okay. I didn't quite catch that.
That's all I have to say.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That really great feedback, Babak. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you.